all of your hope. We get out of here, you in the shower sing.
This is Dystopia Now, a show where a comedian and an academic explore the philosophies and religions of Silicon Valley and the tech billionaires shaping our country, our world, and our future. I'm Kate Willett, and my co-host is Èmile Torres.
That's when it suddenly hit me. Let's let the filthy billionaires all leave for Mars, 'cause we don't want them here. They steal what...
Hello, and welcome back to Dystopia Now. I am Kate Willett.
I'm Èmile P. Torres.
And I have a lot of questions about the effective altruism community this week. We are going to get into neo-reactionary stuff, as we promised, but it's very present in my mind because I'll tell you what happened. So basically, Ezra Klein and this Atlantic writer, Eric Thompson, released a book. And the book is called Abundance. I have only read some of it. I read a little bit. I haven't finished it or anything. And I'm honestly not sure that I will. But I think that the basic idea behind it is like a lot of it is, housing, basically, that we change the zoning ordinances and that will lead to a building boom. And I am skeptical of the second part. I'm fine with changing the zoning ordinances, but in my opinion, from the data I've looked at, it's not a realistic plan to have enough building that prices would actually be affordable for somebody who is making minimum wage or whatever. So I'll go into more of my own skepticism later. But it also seems like it talks about other kind of like general liberal stuff, green energy, and also just permitting process. And the kind of theme of it is, as I understand, that, all sort of like we have these bad regulations, and by repealing some of them, we could have a much better society. Okay, well, I don't really have any issue with anything so far. Some of the policy proposals that they're suggesting are fine. Some of them I would modify. For example, I would say that the U.S. should invest a lot of money in public housing, but, small quibbles so far. However, the network behind this is very disturbing. Looking at and by network behind it, I mean, I'll explain what I think might be happening, but I'm not 100% sure. So Open Philanthropy, which is an effective altruist organization that funds every YIMBY organization in the country, basically, or if not all of them, most of them. They announced in short order a $120 million grant for Abundance. Niskanen Center announces, which is like a kind of libertarian-aligned think tank. They announce an article which kind of outlines their plan for the Democratic Party. They say the Abundance faction will enter the battle for the future of the Democratic Party by initially organizing three groups: intellectuals and activists motivated by a different set of issues than those that have animated our politics for the last 50 years, a segment of business alienated from the radicalized Republican Party and drawn into the Abundance faction's congenial policy, and socially moderate and economically activist, growth-oriented voters. So basically, they have a plan to get, moderate Republicans. Surprise, surprise. And it starts seeming like this is, it's not just a book. It's an aligned network of think tanks that are trying to, astroturf some kind of movement within the Democratic Party. And that is also not new, right? Where I start getting really weirded out is I look at some of the people affiliated with this. Richie Torres has really been promoting the book. Some really right-wing people, like the Foundation for American Innovation, which was an advisor for Project 2025. They were one of the think tanks in there. It just starts feeling like, okay, there's some pretty right-wing players that are involved in this that maybe even go further than the moderate Republican. And then one of the co-authors of the book does a podcast with this guy named Richard Hanania, who was just outed less than 2 years ago for being one of the main Nazi posters on Richard Spencer's website, a self-identified white supremacist. There was an article back in the day in the Atlantic about it, but truly said some just disgusting things that you would think no one could come back from. You know, like he called for Black people to be sterilized. He said that, like, he's done a lot of like posting about, you know, how he thinks that Black people have lower IQs than white people, and just really sickening. And like, I think he did some kind of like fake apology, but the stuff that he's still saying after that fake apology is truly disgusting.
It's consistent with those claims
yeah, it's
he was making
consistent with
before.
those beliefs.
Yeah, he was posting under a pseudonym,
Yeah,
or just posting anonymously. So there was this article that came out that identified him as the individual who was making these horrific claims on these white nationalist, white supremacist blogs.
And then he says he's not a Nazi anymore. But I'll show you something that he said in 2023. This is a quote from Richard Hanania on May 13th, 2023. I don't have much hope that we'll solve crime in any meaningful way. It would require a revolution in our culture or form of government. We need more policing, incarceration, and surveillance of Black people. Blacks won't appreciate it. Whites don't have the stomach for it. Obviously, a disgusting racist thing to say. You know, he's said other stuff. He's tweeting very sympathetic stuff to Daniel Penny, the man who murdered Jordan Neely on transit in New York. He was, and I just searched like the word like IQ in his Twitter. And this guy is still like a mega race scientist, which is the euphemism for people who believe that like IQ is racially determined and or even that IQ is a thing at all. It's very gross. And he's still saying a lot of this stuff. It's a little more concealed at this point, but I'm like, well, why the fuck would an Atlantic writer go on this guy's podcast?
So on a previous episode, we discussed, well, I actually read excerpts from a blog post by Brian Kaplan.
Yeah.
Where he talks about IQ realists, right?
Yeah.
And he said it's just, if you're talking to an IQ realist, somebody who believes that IQ is a measure that accurately captures some real property of individuals, in particular their capacity to perform well on a wide range of cognitive tests, a property referred to by psychologists as G, the G factor.
Yeah.
So that's
I noticed that in Richard Hanania's tweets.
Yeah, so they'll refer to the G factor. These are people who believe that's a real thing. And essentially what IQ tests do is present a linear ranking on which you can place every human being. So everyone has an IQ score. You could place them on this ranking. People at the top are superior, are better, and so on. And so basically Brian Kaplan was saying it takes 3 minutes, if you're an IQ realist talking to another IQ realist, for them to start talking about like mass sterilization in Africa, or even something like genocide. These ideas are not that uncommon. Sadly, I mean, they're horrendous ideas, but they're quite common among people who take IQ very seriously.
It's incredibly disturbing stuff. And then I think like the next day, there's another guy, David Shore, who is one of the most important pollsters in the Democratic Party. He's also a very influential consultant type, and he came up with this theory called popularism, just a sort of self-explanatory, where they're like, oh, the Democratic Party should just do what's popular. And that, even if that means that you have to abandon some people's rights for now, that, in the long run, if Democrats win, that's way better. And you can see a logic for like, especially where, it's like, okay, where it's something that isn't about civil rights, if like, some sort of like government program is polling really poorly and some scaled back version of that program polls a lot better, it's like go with public opinion. But one thing that the popularists have never applied this logic to is the polling around Gaza. Like the ceasefire polls really well, and, continuing to support Netanyahu and what I would call a genocide, and what every human rights org for the most part in the world is calling a genocide. Like this is really unpopular, and
including Jewish genocide scholars.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, and so it's like, okay, well, why does that not fall under the banner of popularism? Like, why is like working really hard for a negotiated peace is definitely probably a more popular idea. Why are we not doing that, according to this electoral strategy? And then somebody posts on Blue Sky, this guy, Theophyte, Rev Howard Arson, posts some screenshots of what he says is David Shore's alt. Now, I gotta be like careful about this because we don't know if this is David Shore. This is a suspicion. We're not sure, like I'm not saying that he definitely did this, but it seemed like a lot of people in that thread were like, oh, everyone's kind of known about this, about these screenshots and the data world for years. So I'm like, this is an allegation. This has not been proven in a court of law. But what they say is he posts Sweden's 10 most wanted. And, it's in the things that he posts, it's not white people. And he says, like, you really can't understand crime without starting with race. And then someone responds to him and says, I thought it was going to be all Arabs, but they've got Eastern Europeans and a Chinese guy too, quite diverse. Okay, so I guess some of them were white. He's also racist towards Eastern Europeans, which is like, this guy's committed to racism, let's just say. And he responds, vibrant. Like, if that is David Shore, and it seems like people who know him were finding that plausible, so I don't think it's out of left field. Like, it's like the second effective altruism related race science scandal in the past couple of days. And I was looking into some of their conferences, and it seems like they are actually having some of these far-right race scientist IQ type of people there. And I wondered if that is a possibility here of like why an Atlantic writer will go on a Nazi podcast and not really worry about it in a way that would have been a thing like 2 years ago. It's because they are both from the EA world. This is somewhat speculation, but like, talk to me about, is this a thing?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I think the circle of people who are IQ realists overlaps pretty significantly with the circle of individuals who accept a view called human biodiversity. Right.
Yeah.
And so this sounds benign. This sounds okay.
I think
Not
we talked
problematic.
about that last time, human biodiversity, and I said that it sounded like a vaginal health commercial.
Right.
Yeah. The flora and the fauna. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, that is essentially the view that, there are differences between racial groups, and some of these differences include the different groups' intellectual capabilities. And so this is it's a view that has no actual basis in the best science today. In fact, this whole idea of race as constituting a group such that the group members all share certain properties that people outside of that group don't share. This was an idea that really emerged during the Enlightenment, 18th century. And we just didn't have the same notion of race before that. Right. So there were Africans in Europe for the longest time. And obviously people noticed a difference. But this idea that, okay, I can infer certain things about you, about your capacities and so on, based on your membership in this racial group, that is a new idea. And we have the Enlightenment to thank for that.
Yeah.
Our modern notion of racism really traces its origins back to the Enlightenment. But also, this sort of IQ realist view, that is very popular. IQ realism is very popular within the TESCREAL movement. So we've mentioned that acronym a few times.
Yeah.
It stands for a whole bunch of different ideologies, from transhumanism, the T, to long-termism, the L. Transhumanism is really the backbone of the TESCREAL bundle. So once you understand transhumanism, you really sort of are able to grasp the essence of this movement. It's really just this techno-utopian movement that aims to use advanced technology to re-engineer ourselves and ultimately go out and colonize space. IQ is lots of people take it seriously in that community. I was told, I've not independently verified this, but I was told by somebody who was a participant in the rationalist movement in the Bay Area, that oftentimes when they would go to rationalist meetups, they'd introduce themselves by stating their name followed by a number. And the number would be their IQ.
So what is rationalism?
Rationalism is this ideology that was founded by an autodidact, a guy who never actually graduated from high school, named Eliezer Yudkowsky. But he has gained a kind of cult-like following in the Bay Area especially. He is a transhumanist who participated in the extropian movement in the 90s. That was the first organized modern transhumanist movement. Yudkowsky writes about the singularity. In fact, he founded this institute in 2000 called the Singularity Institute, which, as it happens, got funding from Peter Thiel.
Yeah.
So,
and what's extropianism again?
This is this kind of libertarian version of transhumanism. So
Okay.
Ayn Rand was actually on their official reading list.
Okay.
But it's really just the first organized instance of modern transhumanism.
Okay.
So late 1980s, early 90s is when it emerged. And it has kind of deeper connections to the whole cryonics movement. So the founder of extropianism, who also claims to be the founder of modern transhumanism, a guy named Max More. He was born Max O'Connor, changed his name to better reflect his extropian values, Max More. In fact, his wife also changed her name. Her first name is Natasha. Her last name is hyphenated Vita More, so more life. And Max More was then the CEO of Alcor, one of the leading cryonics companies. So that's what extropianism is. That's what rationalism is. And really a key idea behind rationalism is that, okay, look, if we're going to try to build techno-utopia, we're going to need a lot of really high IQ, really smart people doing a lot of really high IQ things. Right? Because we need to develop these advanced technologies, nanotechnology, synthetic biology, AI, and so on, to get to utopia. Those are our vehicles from here to there. And so let's take a step back and figure out the best ways to optimize our rationality. Right? That's what rationalism is all about. And the thing I would say, by the way, about a lot of these ideologies is that I think from a distance, at first glance, they look great. Right? Effective altruism is about like maximizing your positive influence on the world. I'm not against that.
No, neither am I.
Rationalism is about, optimizing your rationality. That sounds great. When you actually look at the details, then you find all sorts of weird problems.
So I've noticed that these like sort of tech movements, they have a habit of naming things in such a way that it makes you sound insane to be opposed to it. I'll give you some examples. Like effective altruism is one thing. Why would I be opposed to altruism? Like this kind of, wonderful thing about people is that they're altruistic, and doing it in an effective way. What's wrong with that? Their housing movement is called the Yes in My Backyard movement. Okay, if you're against that, it's a bad thing. But then you start looking, okay, this is a bunch of Koch-funded think tanks, like trying to roll back tenant protections. Maybe there's a little more to the story, but they're like, oh, you don't like housing? No, I don't like the Koch network,
Yeah.
And then they also call themselves pro-housing. It's like, who is fucking anti-housing? Nobody. I even saw some of them speculating that, tenants' rights people, they actually wish that they could live in a pre-agricultural society and live outdoors nomadically. And this must be why they're against it. And it's like, oh yeah, no, it's not because you're a bunch of right-wing billionaires that are doing really creepy shit, And then their new thing is that, like, abundance, where it's like, okay, the opposite of that is scarcity. Who's in favor of that? And it's just like, okay, but you just read in a little bit more into any of these stuff, and there's two common traits. Like, one, it can't really accomplish what they're saying that they want it to. Like, it has a bunch of logistical problems. Like with housing, for example, the issue that I know the most about, it could, papers on this do show that it does do something to rezone, but, like the benefit is like, rents might not rise as fast. Like it's not a solution for dropping the price, half in a short time period or something, like the way that it's hyped or whatever.
I think pretty early on, people in the TESCREAL movement discovered marketing. Right.
Yeah.
And so particularly in the 20s, there was this huge emphasis on ensuring that the effective altruists, long-termists, and so on movements curate the way that they present themselves to the general public. That's really important because really, if you scratch the surface, the ideologies in these communities are really extreme and radical in all sorts of ways. Actually, going back to the 90s, there was the Extropy Institute, which was the epicenter of the extropian movement. They had a listserv. And this is brought to, so the World Wide Web was pretty new. I think it was 1993 when the World Wide Web was introduced. So this provided a platform, this listserv in particular, for transhumanists all around the world to actually get in touch. The archives are online. You can scroll through. And there was one email from somebody who said, it's really important that we're careful with how we talk to journalists because, and this is their words, I'm more or less quoting, if we're not sufficiently careful, it would be very easy for journalists to label us as, quote, eugenicists and neo-Nazis.
Yeah.
And so there was a kind of self-awareness early on that, like, okay, extropianism, this version of transhumanism, it's pretty radical. And a lot of people are, in my opinion at least, going to rightly describe it as eugenics. And I don't know, not that far from neo-Nazism in many ways. And also on this listserv, this is where Nick Bostrom sent his email where he said, quote, "Blacks are more stupid than whites." And then he went on to write the N-word.
That's crazy.
Yes.
And Nick Bostrom is somebody that a lot of people in the effective altruism, long-termist community look up to and admire.
Absolutely, yes. He's one of the biggest figures within the whole TESCRO movement. I mean, he's probably the most influential transhumanist of the past 30 years. And he's also co-founder of long-termism, very much involved in EA, rationalism. He writes about the singularity. And there he was back involved in the extropian movement.
A couple years ago, there was this article that came out, maybe not even a couple years ago, might have just been last year, about how Sam Bankman-Fried, the now disgraced, I don't know if he's still in a cell with Diddy, but nobody wants to admit that they were close friends with Sam Bankman-Fried.
He did this interview with Tucker Carlson recently. So this is online. It's like an hour-long interview while he's in prison.
Wow.
And apparently nobody, the officials at the authorities at the prison were not made aware of this. So as far as I know, up to the present point, since that interview, Bankman-Fried has been in solitary confinement because of that.
I'm a prison abolitionist, but that said, man, if there's one person I want it to fucking happen to, okay, no, I hate pedophiles more, but Sam Bankman-Fried seems like a really horrible guy. This article that came out in June 2024, this is The Guardian, we'll post it in the notes. Sam Bankman-Fried funded a group with racist ties. FTX wants its $5 million back. And so multiple events hosted at a historic former hotel in Berkeley, California, have brought together people from the intellectual movements popular at the highest level in Silicon Valley, while platforming prominent people linked to scientific racism, The Guardian reveals, because of the alleged financial ties between the nonprofit that owns the building, Litecoin Infrastructure, and jailed crypto mogul Sam Bankman-Fried. The administrators of FTX, Bankman-Fried's failed crypto exchange, are demanding that the return of almost $5 million that the new court filings allege were used to bankroll its purchase of the property. The article goes on. It's interesting, but the part that was really interesting to me is I look at the speaker list for this Manifest conference in the past 2 years, and it's literally everybody that I think is a really horrible person.
Yudkowsky,
and I didn't even know that.
Hanania?
Yeah, it's just. I'll share some names with you. I don't think that Hanania wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part is that every just the amount of respectable centrists that are hanging out at this stuff. It describes itself as Manifold is hosting a festival for prediction markets, Manifest 2024. We'll have serious talks, attendee-run workshops, and fun side events over the weekend. So that was their description from 2024.
You mentioned the Niskanen Center earlier.
Yeah.
There was somebody who works there, who I used to know back in the day, who gave a talk at the Manifest conference as well. So yet another connection here. There's
probably people on here that I don't even know are horrible, but the special guest, it's like a situation where Nate Silver, okay, I know Nate Silver, I don't like all of his opinions, but ultimately seems like a fairly mainstream figure, a polling analyst who is annoying, but it's I would never describe Nate Silver as being a Nazi. If you know something about Nate Silver, I don't get mad at me, just don't have the information yet. But then he's next to Robin Hanson, who is this professor that I think you have told me about, is arguing for redistribution for women for sex. Is that the incel economist you were telling me about?
Yes, exactly. So in the aftermath of an incel terrorist attack, which killed, I cannot remember, but something like 7 people, he wrote a post and said, okay, if you are a progressive who believes in the distribution of wealth, because there are people out there who need food, homes, electricity, and so on, then you should also be in favor of sex redistribution. There are people out there who are incels, who are suffering, just like poor people are suffering, because they don't have enough food. There are incels out there who are suffering because they don't have enough sex. So you should also be open to that. And this resulted in Slate. Slate did not call him the creepiest economist in America, but they asked the question, is he? And the other thing to mention about Robin Hanson is he's a men's rights activist. He's written some truly awful blog posts on overcoming bias. That's his blog, which is what, as we mentioned in a previous podcast, it was overcoming bias that was the platform that Curtis Yarvin used to gain attention initially. So there's a direct connection between Robin Hanson and Curtis Yarvin. One of the blog posts, I'm hesitant to even reiterate the title, but it is literally, quote, "The Gentle, Silent Rape." And it is worse than the title suggests. It is truly, truly awful. On another occasion, Robin Hanson argued that the problem with the Holocaust is there weren't enough Nazis. And he had this whole economic argument that how if like the Jewish people were willing to give up a certain amount of money not to be targeted, and there were enough Nazis who, so I can't remember, he got the math to work, but obviously the whole premise of this thing is just like atrocious.
People are trying to like math themselves into Nazism. Some other figures that stood out to me, you can tell me if any that stood out to you. This is Manifest 2023. So there's the Hanson guy, but then like right next to him is Dylan Matthews, who is the head writer at Vox's EA Vertical Future Perfect. Destiny, who is one of the most pro-genocide YouTubers. The stuff that he says is honestly just so racist. He considers himself a liberal, but I feel like he goes into far right territory sometimes. There is that woman, Ella, or maybe I'm saying her name wrong. Ella. Okay, yeah. And I mean, she's funny, but she's like a hardcore libertarian. But then, there's like Richard Hanania, who is a very sickening individual that we've talked about. And right next to him is Jeremiah Johnson, who is the co-founder of the Center for New Liberalism. Center for New Liberalism is an offshoot of the Progressive Policy Institute, PPI, which is an offshoot of the Third Way think tank. And I think they emerged out of Reddit, are neoliberal. And this guy, Jeremiah Johnson, he is, I think, one of the main kind of people on Twitter that is promoting a lot of the like GIMBY stuff. Like anytime someone tweets about like how people are struggling economically, he'll respond and be like, "Oh, not really." I know like one of the think tanks that they're affiliated with in their network, like it was either PPI or Third Way. Mm-hmm. They, there was some info available about their funders that The Intercept broke, and they had gotten funding from like ExxonMobil, and it's just really gross. But this is a very sort of like mainstream, allegedly liberal, neoliberal person defining a lot of housing discourse that is like getting written into policy. Like this was a big part of the platform of the like Kamala Harris administration, and he's right next to a Nazi. And I'll tell you why I think that's important. Like you want the people, or I want the people, and you probably agree, who are writing something like housing policy to be thinking about not being racist. I don't know a better way to say it, but for example, if you're going to like redevelop a neighborhood where there is a ton of black and brown tenants, like you don't want the person writing that to be a fucking racist. Like you want to write protections into the law that is, to make sure that people get to keep their housing. And I'm uncomfortable with the fact that like some of these think tank people are just hanging out with literally actual fucking Nazis, the Vox guy. And it seems like it is all through this kind of like, EA sort of terrestrial community.
Yeah. Can I mention something kind of shocking?
Yes, absolutely.
Which is that some of these people would argue, I know this for fact because I was in that community and I spoke to, a lot of people who also identified as transhumanists and long-termists and so on. Some of them argue that actually racism is the best way to help marginalized communities. So for example, I was at this 2-month-long workshop in Gothenburg, Sweden. And the focus was existential risk, which is probably the single most important idea within the whole test grill movement, because it's just any event that prevents us from creating techno-utopia in the future. And I had this long conversation with one of the speakers there who was saying that the only way white people in the West can muster up enough sympathy to actually help people in the global South, for example, is to acknowledge that people in the global South can't help it, and that they're poor for a reason. It's because they're basically just inferior. And he said only once you sort of recognize this quote unquote fact, that's when you suddenly, I feel really sorry for them. And so he was like, I donate to charities in the global south, helping people, deal with, who are, trapped in cycles of poverty and so on. And the reason I do it is because of what he himself referred to as, quote, the racist view. And so this is 2017, and this was the moment I came back from Sweden to the US with my jaw still on the ground, and I was like, "Oh shit! This community,
the people that I'm hanging out with aren't so good."
yeah, this is not what I mean. Before that, like, I really participated in the community from a distance. Like, I just published a lot of papers and exchanged emails, so I never had these conversations over drinks. In the evening. And so that was the moment when I was like, maybe this is not my epistemic or moral community.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the thing that we were talking about, where it sounds like it's going to be something good. Altruism, okay, yeah. Helping people. Who's against helping people? No one, But then it's like, this is eugenics. This is genocidal, and it's it's to me, it's just very strange that there's kind of like this, these sort of mixers for mainstream political figures and pundits, and nobody seems to really, and like Nazis, and nobody seems to mind, right? Because let's say if Gillibrand went to a party with David Duke, people would be like, that's really fucked up. They would correctly recognize it as very disturbing piece of information. But I think with these kind of TESCREAL type people, like, it's just so complicated to explain how and why they are racist that it becomes more difficult for people to oppose it. And, even with someone like Hanania, who was like, I'm a Nazi. My whole thing is that I don't like black people and Jewish people, and even when he scaled it back, like, they're still trying to launder his reputation as like, well, we have to reach out to the right, we have to work with Republicans to beat Trump, and it's like, not Nazis.
By the way, Hanania identifies with the TESCREAL movement.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying. Like, that is what's kind of started me on this whole path in the first place, is I'm like, that this seems to be a vehicle for some of the truly worst people in the world to meet the people that are actually writing policy that gets implemented even by Democrats at these think tanks and stuff.
Yeah. So, Hanania wrote an entire Substack article on this, and he said that every time he hears the word TESCREAL, it makes his ears bleed or something like that, which, I don't know, fair enough.
And Timnit Gebru, who made up the term, the acronym TESCREAL.
Yeah, I proposed it while we were writing that paper together. So Hanani doesn't like the term. Fine, fair enough. But he says that he absolutely identifies with the community, and he refers to it as the tech right. And I don't think that is entirely inaccurate, because from the beginning, as I mentioned before, there was this very strong libertarian kind of right-wing element going back to extropianism, with their infatuation with Ayn Rand and so on. And that, more recently, the EA community has conducted internal surveys, including surveys focused on political beliefs of members. And there is a majority of EAs who consider themselves to be on the political left. So, like, okay, that's interesting. On the one hand, I think the results might be skewed in the sense that the surveys include anybody who identifies as an EA. And there are lots of EAs who are involved on a very local level, who aren't really involved in the movement, right? They just have their little group that meets bi-weekly or whatever, and they're just focused on global poverty or animal welfare, something like that.
Yeah.
But the core aspect of the movement there's been a strong right-wing element in it. There's been an enormous tolerance for far-right views. Robin Hanson, for example, he held a position at the Future of Humanity Institute for many, many years. Everybody knew he's a men's rights activist who had said these utterly bizarre things about sex redistribution and so on. Nobody really cared. And then also within the movement, even people who identify with the left are pretty sympathetic with, IQ realism and human biodiversity, eugenics, and so on, which historically, eugenics was popular on both the political right and the political left. But among the left, there's been a general kind of distaste with that view, at least, second half of the 20th century. And so, there's always been these sort of right-wing elements. I mean, Sam Bankman-Fried has said in the year or two leading up to the collapse of FTX, he was actually donating just as much money to Republican candidates as Democratic candidates. And then obviously he went on Tucker Carlson recently, I think in hopes of getting a pardon from Donald Trump, which for all I know, he might get. So he might be out of prison pretty soon. You said you're a prison abolitionist, but if there's anybody who deserves it.
While we have it, let's leave him in there.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I was thinking about it, and it's like, you know, in terms of like the tech right, which is, you know, a term that we talked about on the show with Jacob Silverman, like one person that I would say is non-negotiably on that list would be Mark Andreessen. He's a Trump supporter. He is into this Curtis Yarvin nonsense. You know, he's one of the advisors on Doge. Like, I don't think that there's a lot of debate that he's right wing. And he is doing a fundraiser for Ruben Gallego. And the speakers are, Mark Andreessen and Matt Iglesias, who is, I think, somebody that would be considered, like, I would consider him a centrist, center-right, but he's presenting as a liberal, sympathetic to progressive aims, even if he has a different view of it. But it's like he's hanging out with this man he believes in a fascist vision of this country.
In his Optimist Manifesto, he lists as one of the inspirations a fascist who was part of the futurist movement in Italy. So, and this guy wrote, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, this Italian futurist wrote, I think it's called the Fascist Manifesto or something like that. It's some part to play in that. So yeah, I mean, Mark Andreessen, I don't think there's any debate that he's like pretty far right and quite open with a broadly fascist approach to governing.
But then, you know, someone like Iglesias, who's like hanging out with him for this weekend, this $5,000 weekend where they're the featured speakers. Like, I think that this kind of Vox adjacent community of people who are, you know, I think that they're very test real sympathetic, if not effective altruists and long-termists themselves. Like, they're, you know, they may not be like Nazis themselves, but they're like very comfortable in this community. Yeah. So to me, a proposal that they become like the dominant faction in the Democratic Party, like, that's a fucking disaster, because that means that Mark Andreessen is having a major influence on both parties. That eliminates the possibility of opposition. Now, I don't think that of the issues that this country has now and the issues that it is going to have in 4 years, which after Doge will certainly be worse, I don't think that any candidate can win on a platform of zoning reform. It's just too small. Even the places where it would be useful and effective and should be done, it's not necessarily an electorally mobilizing issue. And if anything, it's a demobilizing issue, because like a lot of times if you tell people we're going to change your whole neighborhood, there is real NIMBYism. But what seemed to me like might be happening, especially when you see, like, you know, they're having these like abundance conferences and all these right-wing think tanks, like, you know, Stand Together, which is like a Koch network org, and the Foundation for American Innovation, which is an explicitly right-wing org, and then Open Philanthropy, which is like a allegedly sort of progressive aligned effective altruist organization. And then in that same week, we see, like, you know, Chris Murphy and Adam Schiff, like, they're going on TV shows, and then these are all their new talking points. Like, they just kind of immediately change to like, yes, the most important thing in our country is to build stuff. And I do wonder if it's an attempt to get back close to Silicon Valley, after pissing Silicon Valley off by having like some people in the Biden administration who would regulate them whatsoever. And what it seems to me, kind of apart from Ezra Klein's book, is that there is a vision being presented where we don't have to regulate tech, and actually would be harmful too, even if that's not the stuff that a liberal like Ezra Klein is talking about.
So I have two thoughts.
Yeah.
One is that a criticism of the left is that we don't have a comprehensive, inspiring vision of the future that is comparable to what the right wing has. And the way I would articulate my view is by pointing to different futurological visions that have become popular on the right, you know, transhumanism, long-termism, and so on, pointing to those and saying, not those.
Yeah.
Something else.
I don't want to be an Andreessen serf.
Right.
I do not want drone warfare on my community all the time from my tech warlord who owns all the water.
Yeah. And also I'm not excited by the thought of like eliminating nature. This is an actual view that Will MacAskill discusses in his 2022 book on long-termism.
And Will MacAskill is one of the academics who is the heart of the long-termist thought, right?
Absolutely. He was the moral advisor to Sam Bankman-Fried. MacAskill also privately texted Elon Musk before Musk bought Twitter in hopes of getting Musk to buy Twitter with Bankman-Fried.
Sounds like more of an immoral advisor to me. Yeah.
So, yeah, and the other thought that I have is there is this framework that was proposed, I want to say in the 1980s, by some proto-transhumanists. Well, to put that differently, they were transhumanists. They just weren't modern transhumanists. And I could explain the distinction at some point. But they were transhumanists, such as this guy named FM 2030. They changed his name. Because he hoped to live until at least 2030. And in fact, he was with, for some time, Natasha Vita-More before she was Vita-More. So there are lots of connections here. And anyways, he proposed this, or at least developed this idea that in the future, and right now we're in the future, so maybe this is actually happening, there will be a new political axis that supersedes the right-left political axis and is sort of like orthogonal to it. But this new axis will be much more important than right or left. And he called the two poles upwingers and downwingers. And upwingers are those who are basically pro-transhumanism, for technology. They're technophilic. They want to develop these technologies. They want to integrate technology into our bodies and ultimately to transcend the human form. And then downwingers are those who oppose that. So I used to be an upwinger in this sense, and now I'm very much a downwinger for a variety of reasons that I think are much more compelling than the arguments for being an upwinger. But maybe this kind of provides a bit of a framework for thinking, for making sense of how it is that these EA long-termists like Dylan Matthews and the others who, purport to be located on the left of the horizontal political axis end up like kind of rubbing elbows with Richard Hanania, and maybe it's that upwinger common denominator that is what brings them together. Yeah. Whereas like Steve Bannon is vociferously opposed to transhumanism, right? And so am I. I think our reasons are different, but it could become the case as these technologies become more prevalent, as the power of Silicon Valley grows even more. It could be the case that in a certain sense, Bannon and I are essentially, I'm never going to lock arms with him for obvious reasons. He's a horrific individual, but like we might end up being like in an important sense, kind of located in the same general region of the, up-down political axis. It's really interesting to think about. Yeah.
What you're saying makes a lot of sense to me. I want to read you just one thing that I think substantiates what you're saying. I will read you just a tiny, tiny bit of the intro to Ezra Klein's book.
Oh, gosh. I didn't ask for this.
No, I know. But just basically, because I think it just really substantiates what you're saying. I won't read too much, but the year is 2050. You walk to the kitchen to turn on the sink. Water from the ocean pours out of the faucet. It's fresh and clear, piped from a desalinization plant. I think climate people don't believe that desalinization is the path forward, but I don't know. I don't know enough to opine. That's not the really weird part yet.
But also just remember that when the ocean is closer, it makes it even more convenient.
Yeah. But so here is the part that I'm like, here's the part that made me think, like, this is Mark Andreessen for libs. Out of the window and across the street, an autonomous drone is dropping off the latest shipment of star pills. Several years ago, daily medications that reduced overeating, cured addiction, and slowed cellular aging were considered miracle drugs for the rich, especially when we discovered the key molecules were best synthesized in the zero-gravity conditions of space. But these days, automated factories thrum in low orbit. Cheap rocketry conveys the medicine down to Earth, where it saved millions of lives and billions of healthy years. Outside, the air is clean and humming with the purr of electric machines all around you. Electric cars and trucks glide down the road, quiet as a light breeze and mostly self-driving. Children and adult commuters follow on electric bikes and scooters, some personally owned and some belonging to subscription networks. I like how they're still not public in that case. He's a true neolib. Another last-minute delivery drone descends from the canopy level, pauses over a neighbor's yard like a hummingbird, and drops off a package. These e-bots now deliver a sizable chunk of online orders, much reducing the drudgery of human delivery work. And then he goes on and basically just says, that poverty is now gone, that people can work very little because we have a bunch of AI now. It's a utopian vision. And the first kind of chapter outside of the intro, he identifies, people who ideologically believe in degrowth as a problem. And I'm like, to me, that's where it started reminding me of Van Driesen. Because, I don't think that there's that many people who are like, yeah, I'm a degrowther. That seems like more of an academic thing that most people don't even know what it means. And I worry that these people are, especially maybe not Klein himself, but the people in this network, what they mean is people who believe climate science and want to do what the scientists are saying and not what Andreessen is thinking. And it just seems like it's what's being proposed is a very super pro Silicon Valley liberalism, which is kind of a fucking weird time for it, I would say, given what's going on.
I mean, it's techno-solutionism.
Yeah.
It's just, there's this idea that I find to be quite absurd, which is that this much technology is having catastrophic consequences in the world. But this even greater amount of technology, everything's going to be solved. We're always just right around the corner from having enough technology to solve all our problems, even though many of these same people will acknowledge that a lot of the problems we're facing is either the result of, or at least enabled by, technology. And so this is sort of my critique. So I'm not opposed to technology at all.
Neither am I.
Yeah, but it's this kind of fixation on techno-solutionism, on the technologies being if we only had more technology. That seems and there's something rich about that coming from people in this EA long-termist community where the most important topic is existential risk. Why? Because people in these communities say that the likelihood of an existential catastrophe this century is greater than ever before in human history, going back 300,000 years, right? And why is that? They'll say it's because of technology. The overwhelming source of existential risk is these advanced technologies. So there's something rich about them saying okay, yes, there's a clear correlation. More technology, more risk, more possibility for catastrophe, disasters, calamities, cataclysms, whatever. But if we just build this next new generation of even more advanced technology, then all our problems will be solved. And I do not understand why that is a good argument.
No, it's kind of an absurd argument, right? Because all right, so a point of view that Ezra Klein has, that I share, is that we should invent new medicines. And that's great. Medical science, there's problems with drug companies, but for the most part, it's a fucking miracle that we have vaccines. It's a miracle. There's new ways of treating cancer, and I'm not against any of that stuff. But if your political analysis does not include why people don't have insulin, a thing that has been around since 1923 and was patented for $1, then it's a dumb political analysis. We already have that as a society, and people are still out here paying hundreds of dollars or dying without it because the rich loot and his billionaire friends, they can make more money off keeping insulin scarce and making small modifications that they then patent, and the whole world of why there's not enough insulin and why it's so expensive is it's detailed, and I'm the wrong person to explain it, but it does just sort of seem to be this sort of vision that is being offered as a contrast to the the Bernie anti-oligarchy politics. So I didn't read the entire book, but in fairness, I did sit through an entire interview with Ezra Klein for an hour where he was talking about the book, and so I feel fairly confident that I got the gist of his ideas. Yeah. And one thing that he was saying is that he considers himself very different than Mark Andreessen. That Mark Andreessen is the kind of person that he's having this conversation with, and I'm sure he is different. Like, I'm sure that Mark Andreessen wants to take more risks than Ezra Klein. I'm sure that Ezra Klein believes in a much stronger social safety net than Mark Andreessen, because Ezra Klein is a liberal. But at some point, it seems like it's the narcissism of small differences, particularly when nobody wants to like talk about like, hey, maybe we shouldn't let these guys fucking loot our society anymore, and perhaps we should tax billionaires out of existence, and the ones that have done crimes, maybe we should put them in jail, you know?
I completely agree with that. It sort of makes me think of a line from Martin Rees, who is an astronomer in the UK, who's also kind of been involved in this general terrestrial space, although he has much more moderate views than people like Nick Bostrom. And as far as I could tell, Martin Rees is a genuinely good guy. But basically his claim was that all this talk from so-called new optimists like Steven Pinker.
Yeah. And this is, I think, in that realm for sure.
Absolutely. That's my impression as well. Steven Pinker, Ezra Klein, and so on, all of these individuals represent this idea of new optimism, that we've made lots of progress over time. Our World in Data would be another example, which, as it happens, shares office space with the Center for Effective Altruism in Oxford, which shared office space with the Future of Humanity Institute before it was shut down, in part possibly because of Bostrom's email. But basically, Martin Rees says, like, it's not, if we're measuring progress or the sort of health of society in terms of like how much people have, like that's not, maybe not the right way. It's how many people don't have.
Yeah, and that is a thing that like a lot of these type of guys make. It's a point that they're like, well, the poor live now better than a king did, 200 years ago. He didn't have a TV. And it's like, who fucking cares? It's really like, what does the person who is on food stamps have compared to Mark Andreessen?
Also, okay, they didn't have TV back then, but also they weren't nearly as atomized and alienated.
Yeah.
The loneliness pandemic didn't exist back then. In fact, there was a book by a historian on the history of loneliness. And the historian noted that before 1800, you basically never find any reference to loneliness in the literature. Because people...
A lot of references to get the fuck out of my face. Let me have a little privacy.
People back then, they were alone, but this feeling that we have of loneliness that so many people have today, and by so many, I mean like 40 to 50%.
Yeah, and of all genders. Like, it's kind of dumb when people talk about like the male loneliness pandemic, because a lot of people are lonely.
Absolutely.
Many people.
And young people. Young people and old people in particular. So I think this sort of gets back to this meta-narrative of progress that is sort of the background to a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, definitely the Ezra Klein stuff. And yet another criticism that occurs to me that to share is that I think a lot of the problems that we've solved with technology, which give the robust impression of progress being made, those are problems that we've introduced.
Yeah.
So like one kind of silly example that I sometimes use is like, if you look at my teeth, they're all perfectly aligned. That's because I had braces when I was a kid. And I had multiple teeth. I have fewer teeth than what I should have. Multiple teeth pulled to get all my big teeth to fit together and so on. So I've got teeth that look aesthetically nice.
Congratulations. Mine are just okay. Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
No, I'm just joking.
I'm trying to get to a point here.
I understand. I'm just cracking some jokes.
No, I do have perfect teeth. But if you look back at our ancestors, a lot of people don't know this. In the Paleolithic, for example, before the first great agricultural revolution, sometimes called the Neolithic Revolution, they had straight teeth. And in fact, they didn't need their wisdom teeth pulled. They grew in just fine. They never got impacted like mine did, which caused a huge amount of pain. They all had straight teeth. They didn't need braces. It's kind of surprising to find out, but if you look at the fossils, all their teeth are aligned. So there's a sense in which if you look at modern orthodontistry, you might say, oh, well, it has made progress, right? It's improved like our physical appearance and so on. It looks like progress. It looks like, scientists did some work and figured out how to actually straighten people. But this is a problem that didn't exist before. And, there's some anthropologists who talk about like diseases of civilization. These are diseases that people in the past didn't have. Things like global pandemics or even localized pandemics, they were pretty rare back when we were hunter-gatherers and so on. So it's not to say that there hasn't been progress, because I don't think that.
Yeah.
It's just it is a request to reassess the extent to which we have made progress. And I think when you do that, you realize like, oh, actually, like, we have progressed in various ways, but like not as much as these triumphalist advocates of progress make it seem. So anyways, I'm going off on a tangent on why I don't like this idea of progress as it is oftentimes presented in public discussions.
I 100% agree. And, it's like, okay, there's some stuff that we could invent that would be really useful, like just curing all forms of cancer. Okay,
Yeah.
Amazing. That would be awesome. But, there's other stuff that we could invent that would be really harmful. Like, I don't know, like these like AI sex doll girlfriends or whatever. I think that this is going to become, psychotic at some point. It's just, and then when it comes to stuff like replacing so many people's jobs, okay, well, that could be good or it could be harmful. It depends, like, do people have enough money to live on? Like, do we still have political power? If the wealth is distributed and everybody has enough, it could be awesome. The how is really important. But another thing about the kind of progress narrative that I will say is really concerning is like in this build vision, it's all about like making as much supply as possible. And it kind of reminds me of long-termism because it's like the end goal is the most important thing. And something like labor is an obstacle, right? Like, so something like a union, that's increasing costs. And obviously people are going to take this to more or less extreme degrees. I don't think that, Klein is probably anti-union, but like most of the other people who believe in this stuff really strongly are, because it's like if you're a worker and you're organizing for your rights, or you're a lawmaker and you're saying like, hey, you got to use union labor for this project, then you're impeding progress and you're actually hurting the common good, like this goal of progress. That's a race to the bottom. Also, they're asking us at this point to just like kind of on the climate stuff, like just trust me, bro. We're gonna invent stuff that means that we can emit as much as possible, But it's like, no, I don't trust you, bro.
This idea of abundance goes back a long ways. I mentioned the Enlightenment earlier because it gave us our modern notion of race, which is the basis for modern racism. But also this idea of progress and abundance really goes back to Enlightenment thinkers like Condorcet would be a good example, who literally suggested that as a result of scientific and technological development, future people will be immortal. So he's sort of like pre-echoing ideas that were then more systematically codified or articulated by the transhumanists. There was a Wired article in the 90s that referred to a guy named Eric Drexler as the patron saint of extropianism. And the reason is that he published this book in 1986 called Engines of Creation, about how we're potentially on the verge of creating what he referred to as nanofactories. And these are technologies, little devices that could be small enough to put on your desktop that use some sort of feedstock molecule that is very abundant in the environment, so it's quite cheap. And then you just download blueprints of whatever it is you want to manufacture from the internet. For almost no money, you could manufacture whatever you want. If your phone breaks, you could manufacture a new phone. If you need a new computer or chair or whatever. And so this, later on in 2013, he published a sequel, as it were, to this book called Radical Abundance. And Radical Abundance is what he was talking about the entire time. So basically what Klein and his co-author are talking about is it's the same old idea that like generation or every 2 generations, there are people who are waving their arms in the air saying we're right around the corner. And once again, it's like we got this much technology and we get all sorts of like wealth inequality and pollution and terrible things. But if we just get this extra technology, if we just have a little bit more technology, then we have abundance, we have immortality, we could colonize space, we can cure all diseases and so on.
And, I'll just kind of, just to sort of think about the political aspect of that. Like, we have lots of stuff now, and the rich choose not to share it with us. Why? Yeah. Like, there is more than enough money in this country for every person to have at least some kind of basic room over their head. There's no, and it, compared to like, the amount of wealth, like even one of these like mega billionaires have, like with 1 or 2 of them, we could get everyone in some kind of basic housing. We could have housing, and we could have food for everybody. We can make sure no one goes hungry. We might not have like a world where everyone can be living large in a mansion or something like that, but in terms of the basics, we can absolutely do that stuff right now, and the politics just isn't there. And I don't think that there's any reason to suspect it will be different in the future unless we change our politics, like unless there is a proletarian uprising or movement of some kind, or maybe it could happen and we like vote for AOC and, get money out of our politics. Like, I'm open to the possibility that like a better world could happen politically in multiple different ways, but there's no reason technology in and of itself would change that problem of some people hoarding all the resources, even though there is plenty for everyone.
I completely agree with that. And this is very similar to something I've said with respect to AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is that these companies like OpenAI are claiming that they're building AGI for the benefit of all humanity, and that ultimately they have these profound philanthropic motives behind. But look at their actions. Don't listen to their words. Right now, building the stepping stones to AGI, or at least what they believe are the stepping stones to AGI, they're engaged in massive intellectual property theft, the massive concentration of power in their hands, worker exploitation, especially in the global south, and negative environmental impact. Google's carbon footprint increased since 2019 to the present by 48%. They said
I was thinking probably 5 times, but no, 48 times. That's crazy. That's fucking nuts.
48%. And so then the question is, okay, if they don't give a shit about human beings right now, if they don't give a shit about humanity as they're trying to build these technologies, why would we think that once they develop what they themselves describe as the most powerful technology ever, suddenly empathy is going to take over? And they're going to be like, okay, now that we have the most powerful technology in our control ever created by human beings, now we're going to go out and help poor people and distribute the wealth and create a much more egalitarian society. Why would you think that? No, if they've proven over again that they don't give a shit about humans, why would you think that's going to change in the future once they get AGI?
Yeah,
it's
and
ridiculous.
I completely agree. And it's like this thing that I think that the goal of this whole conversation is politics that is free of talking about inequality, the relations of production, just anything that has to do with power, because, I'll give you a very concrete example. There was this software called RealPage, which allowed landlords to collude with one another on price setting. And they were able to, basically it told them when to keep units vacant. Like, if you could rent it now for $3,500, if you wait, you take it off the market, and in 2 months you can rent it for $6,000, and then you're going to make more money overall. So they found ways to artificially create scarcity, even when scarcity doesn't exist. And that's always going to happen because there's a profit incentive. I mean, look at something like insulin. It can be made for cheap, and it isn't, because it is through the scarcity that the wealth is created. And it's this kind of way of thinking about things asks us to align all of that. And it also, kind of makes labor the enemy, safety, I think with housing in particular. You don't see the liberal abundance guys doing this, but the libertarian guys, they absolutely want to get rid of all the fire codes. They want those fire codes gone, and disability laws gone, and anything that could potentially increase the cost of building something, where it's like a rational person is just going to say okay, yeah, maybe whoever is deciding what the fire laws should be, I want it to be a group of fire engineers that are motivated by human safety, and will do what they say, but I don't want it to be the developer deciding. Yeah. And I also don't want it to be someone who doesn't know anything about the issue. I'm not inherently opposed to better regulations, but if the reason for repealing a regulation is entirely profit motivated, that can lead to disaster pretty quickly.
Disagree.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to disagree with we should try not to burn our homes down just for money or whatever. But I guess the last thing that I want to talk about before we end the podcast today is how much of this hyper utilitarian way of thinking do you feel is inherent to effective altruism? Is this stuff bad in the hands of bad people, or is there something built into it, just inherent to it, that attracts eugenicists and aligns nicely with a eugenicist state of mind?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not really sure. I guess, because utilitarianism is such a quantitative approach to ethics. I think I've mentioned before that I think it's fair to see it as reducing the domain of ethics to a branch of economics, right?
That's a really good way of putting it.
It's just ethics as, these economic calculations, expected value theory, crunching numbers, and so on. And so maybe I'm sure there's some connection between that and, for example, the tendency that some people have toward IQ realism, right? It's just a kind of simplistic, very quantitative framework that you can then superimpose over the messiness of the real world in order to convert chaos to order. And so it's just, if you believe in IQ, for example, that's just a really easy way to kind of make sense of the world, even if it's like deeply flawed and not accurate.
And I think, as you've noted, a lot of these people who are talking about IQ all the time, not to be rude, but they're clearly stupid as fuck. So I'm like, really? I don't know. It doesn't actually seem like white people have the highest IQs, because you're dumb as hell. So, by your own framework, this is failing.
Yeah. Most of the people I know who scored well on that test think IQ is ridiculous. I've got actually one last story to tell about IQ. I don't think I mentioned this on previous podcasts, but apparently the Center for Effective Altruism tested out an internal ranking system of members of the EA community. It was called the Peltive ranking system. I can't remember exactly what it stands for. Potential for effective, long-term, something like that. So there were a bunch of different metrics that were a part of the Peltive ranking system, one of which is IQ, known or perceived. So if members of the EA effective altruist community have IQs of lower than 100, they got Peltive points subtracted. And if they had IQs over 120, they had Peltive points added. So this just foregrounds the weird obsession that a lot of these people have with IQ as a measure for the G factor, general intelligence.
I like to believe a G factor is like how cool of a rapper you are.
What's your G factor? 130?
Well, okay, we didn't end up talking about the neo-reactionary movement today, but I do think a lot of this is connected, because a lot of these figures, IQ, realists, and, the kind of right side of, the extreme techno-optimism, it's the same people. So next week we will get into what we plan to get into, which is Peter Thiel part 2. But, thanks for having this conversation with me. I've been trying to understand what kind of fucking supply these people have gotten so high on, because it really is just honestly pretty stupid to write a book that's like, what if everything was good? You don't want everything to be good? You have some criticisms of my book? Well, why would you want bad things from people? It's just dumb as hell. And I think that a lot of these people in, this test grill community, they do seem like there's just an element of childishness that could be very infuriating.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
All right. I do want to say thank you to our Patreon subscribers, Blaine, Stephalagus, Vigard, Kayla, Molly, Casey Lau, Richard Horseman, luckily not Richard Anania, Jacob Pucola, Phil Giles, In League, Simon, Megan Brokenberg, Christopher Graybill, Deidre O, Mark Gordon, Juan Martinez, Dan Smith, Naomi Winter Vincent, Adam, Michelle, Jason Morgado, What Eves, Carrie Lawrence, and Derek Klipkin. We appreciate you so much. You're the people who keep the show going. We are not, obviously, as Recline, and we're never going to get millions of dollars to criticize Mark Andreessen or to have the kind of career that Richard Hanania has because he is funded by weird tech patrons. When you're talking about leftist stuff, no one is going to give you money to do that except for the people who care about the content. So we deeply, deeply appreciate you.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you for listening to the show. Dystopia Now is a co-production of Èmile Torres and Kate Willett. Our theme song is Hunger Strike by Èmile Torres. We have no outside funding or advertising, so if you can become a contributor on Patreon, we deeply appreciate your help keeping the show going. We are a brand new podcast, so please rate and review us on your podcast platform of choice, and we'd love your help getting the word out. Thank you so much.